Welcome back to The Short Game. It's a show about short video games, games that respect your time. I'm Reagan Kelly, and I am joined by awesome co-hosts and also a guest this week.
Laura Nash.
Shane Kelly.
And this week we are joined by a guest, which is very exciting. We often have guests on this show, but it seemed really appropriate in this case, since we are going to be covering Heaven's Vault, a game that is sort of about archaeology, to have somebody who is at least sort of a subject matter expert. So welcome to the show, Laura Garofalo.
Hi, thanks for the invitation. I'm really excited.
Thank you so much for joining us. Laura is an ancient Roman historian, so she has a little bit of, probably quite a bit of experience with ancient cultures, and is hopefully going to shed some light on where this weird game that approximates archaeology kind of intersects with the actual practice.
Yeah, and Laura and I go way back. I know it's confusing to have two Lauras on the show, but I think it'll be easy to keep straight. But she's got 2 dig seasons at Pompeii, and also she speaks so many dead languages. She's not a linguist, but how many do you speak?
So I do 2 ancient languages, Latin and Greek, and then 3 modern languages. So nothing on the Near Eastern studies people that do like 7 or 8, but like, 2 ancient and 3 modern is enough.
More than all of us combined.
And now you're fluent in Nebula Ancient as well,
yes.
So you can add that to your list. So we're talking this week about Heaven's Vault by Inkle. And if you've been listening to the show for a while, and unfortunately that means for a while, way back in episode 34, you might remember
36.
us talking... Oh, excuse me, thank you. Way back in episode 36, you might remember us talking about a game that, well, we really loved. I think it was our game of the year of 2014. And that's 80, or maybe it took us a little while to get around to it. It might have been our 2015.
I think we played it. I believe we played it after we did Game of the Year, and then we all were like, "Oh, that would have been our Game of the Year," but we played it after the deadline.
Yeah, you're right. That's definitely what happened. Well, anyway, it was one of our favorite games of the early short game era, 80 Days. And 80 Days is by a developer named Inkle that, this is their, it's been a while since they released anything. This was their big project after the huge success of 80 Days. 80 Days was just a mobile, not just, it was a mobile game. It was a blockbuster mobile game that was, really widely praised, and we loved it on this show. And we've been waiting for them to come out with something else afterwards for years. It's been since 2014 when that game came out. And I was really excited when I found out that this was finally coming out. So really excited to play Heaven's Vault. It's a very big departure for them. It's a pretty different sort of game.
Yeah, we were over the moon and a little confused that there are 2 archaeology games coming out this year from people we've anticipated. So the not sequel, but there's also going to be a somewhat sequel to Firewatch. It's archaeology based. So Heaven's Vault is the, I guess, more narrative driven, actual words on screen archaeology, non-violent based game of 2019. Very weird micro trend in indie games, but I was really excited when we emailed them and they said, yes, this is actually beta testers finishing the game in 10 hours. Some of us went as high as 15, but we are happy for a new short game in this genre every time it comes out.
Yeah, and of course, 10 hours is sort of our top limit for the most part, but we made a little bit of an exception for this game. I will warn you, if you're a short game, prescriptionist, yes, actually, that perhaps this doesn't count as a short game if you are following our traditional set of rules, because it did take me closer to 15 hours to complete. But I mean, we can't not talk about the latest game from Inkle.
And considering most games are 40 to 120, we're okay with 15.
Yeah, totally okay. So part of the reason that we wanted to have Laura on the show is that this game has been widely praised for being about archaeology in a way that a lot of other games aren't. So this is an archaeology game, but it's not Tomb Raider. It's not about, going into a ancient crypt and pulling levers and pushing blocks around or shooting T-Rexes. It's a game that feels, or at least to a layperson like myself, feels a little more directly related with what archaeology might potentially actually be if I were to actually know what that meant. And so I kind of wondered if maybe, Laura, you could, I don't know, what were your thoughts on it as from that side of things?
Specifically, I would like to know how much of your job actually does involve T-Rexes, levers, and guns. And as a layperson, I'm sure you get that question a lot, so I apologize.
Yeah, it's
Do
a
you
regular.
write down your inscriptions in something better than a piece of paper and then not take any photographs of the sites you're on? I'd also like to know that.
Yeah, no, I mean, one thing that I loved about this game is how it incorporates the historical aspects as well, that there's several different layers of history within the game, and they change the way that asking questions and reinterpreting objects, or even finding a single object, can change the way that you think about an entire era or an entire culture. That's actually very true to archaeology and the kinds of questions where you don't really know what's happening. But I think especially having that language aspect is much closer to certain types of archaeology than a lot of other games. Like there was an Indiana Jones game that I played once when I was, I don't know, I think at 8 or 10 or something like that. That was mostly like discovering things, breaking things, finding things, kind of loosely related to that.
Probably the LucasArts one. That was actually a totally rad game. That game was awesome.
Yeah, there was like a balloon or something, a hot air balloon at some point.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, it's been years since I played that, but it was actually pretty fun.
Yeah, no, and so you have a nice thing where you actually get to explore and use the language and have it change your opinions on things. You're always asking questions. The fact that it can modify your understanding, that's really, really familiar and really exciting from the experience that I have with archaeology. I think that if anything, it's not really like doing the process of archaeology where you might need years worth of digs and permissions and cultivating local archaeological superintendencies and things like that. And painstakingly with a trowel removing small amounts of soil at a time and recording every possible difference. But I think the exciting adventuring, like finding new things, the exciting parts of research are really there in this game. So that was what made me especially, or what I found especially familiar for this game.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, we should probably just explain a little bit more. We'll talk about the structure of the game and how it actually works in more detail a little later. But I do kind of want to just explain a little bit about how this game functions and how it relates to that archaeology side of things. This is being a game from Inkle. This is got a lot of dialogue in it, so it's very dialogue driven, but structurally you are playing as a character who is exploring a nebula full of habitable moons, and you can sail, we'll talk about that mechanic later, from moon to moon, trying to uncover a mystery. So there's a sort of a central mystery to the game. It's actually very Indiana Jones in that you've got a colleague who's gone missing, and you need to find them, and uncovering that central mystery leads you to discover deeper mysteries about sort of the nature of the world that you're living in and its extremely lengthy history.
There are no Nazis to punch, however.
There are robots. You don't really... the robots aren't...
Laura, do you think robots are Nazis? Like, why that connection? Like, there are no robots. No Nazis. There are robots, though.
No, not accusing robots of anything. However, there are sci-fi elements. It is in space.
Oh yeah, no, yeah.
Let's not forget we've not mentioned this game is set in space.
Yeah, we can't discount that this is like an extremely this is like sort of that rustic sci-fi kind of vibe where you can tell that this is a world built on top of a deeply technological past, but that most of that knowledge has been lost into the distant, history of the world. And sort of structurally, we're talking about a game where, well, for one thing, you're walking around, new for Inkle. That's a very big new thing for them. You're walking around and talking to characters, trying to uncover the mystery of what became of your colleague, and discovering artifacts. And based on all of that, you are deciphering a ancient language that is sort of one of the central mechanics of the game, trying to understand the history of the game by trying to decipher the language of the ancients.
I think the first thing that you learn about the ancients from their language is that these people absolutely, were obsessed with label makers or something. They write on absolutely everything. Woe betide anyone who tries to use the fridge in the ancient's office. You know, you're gonna find everybody's name is on everything, and everything's been staked out.
Every ancient toilet has a sign above it saying, "If you sprinkle when you tinkle." Like literally nothing goes without some sort of label on it. It's very funny when you get down to
I have been in people's homes that look like that, though. To be fair, I guess it's just depending on like if you're at the weird like beach house where every single thing is labeled, or if you're in a modern apartment. When I was looking, I reminded me of when I went to the Roman area of France, and there was just a exhibit in Avignon that was like, oh yeah, like people just kept finding stuff in their backyards. We're swimming in coins here. I was like, I live in America. There's nothing that we're digging up now. It's at most it's from the 80s. I have not lived in a place where the past was that accessible, and I don't know if that is true or not, but it was quite fun. Like, I like language. I like more things for the puzzle vault.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the language puzzle mechanic.
Sure. So as you're going around, as Shane called it, the label makers, they call them inscriptions, which is a little bit more highfalutin. But these inscriptions could be graffiti, they could be books, they could be things written on the back of artifacts. You're constantly digging up artifacts, turning them around and being like, there's no inscription. But 90% of the time there is some marking, whether it's the beginning of a sentence, the middle, the end, or all in one. And you're brought into the interface kind of swims up and you go into the puzzle mechanic. And as someone who's just been playing Spider-Man, where all the puzzles are ones I've seen before, I loved getting a new mechanic. You get a bunch of characters and you try to separate them out into individual words and then assign them meaning. And each word, when you're on it, if you've seen anything like it, up the top of the screen, they mention a couple individual glyphs, then what you guessed for them, so you can kind of reference back. If you really want to, you can go, inception yourself back into that artifact and look at the phrase. But really, you're trying to look at characters you've never seen, and based on the context and what you've seen before, try to decipher the meaning. And as you go throughout the game, you are not only confirming or rejecting words and phrases, but you're also trying to get more and more complex phrases, more and more complex meaning, and trying to figure out the history of the world solely through language that at the beginning you couldn't read.
I don't know if anyone else found that mechanic, if we can get a little more into that, really, really daunting up front. Like, when you first start finding these inscriptions, I think you get maybe a word or two as a gimme. Like, you get, we'll talk later about the character Huang, who helps you out right at the start, and then just throughout the game with some of the translations. But you'll start finding these inscriptions that will maybe be early on. They're pretty short, 3 or 4 words, but eventually they get to be many, many, many words. Some of them, and especially early on, although they provide you with a palette of possible guesses, and theoretically you could guess a full phrase correctly from the beginning, it seems almost impossible. And until you've got a large number of samples, I guess this actually felt pretty realistic for delving into a language. But until you have a huge number of samples, you are going to find it really hard to start identifying trends, because you're going to see a lot of words for the first time. And what's really helped there is the individual characters, and you start to pick up on some of that meaning. So that's my favorite aspect of the translation element, is that early piece where you're swimming in new words, and you're those first few words that you actually do manage to figure out, so satisfying.
You do feel really, really smart when you first figure those out. They're really great. And yeah, Shane, I agree. It was really, really daunting at the start, and that was what made it so satisfying. Is the farther into that process you got, the more you felt wow, I've really mastered something. But of course, you're only kind of actually mastering something. I mean, this is a super abstracted, simplified version of learning a language or deciphering a language. Something that the developer, or one of the directors, Joseph Humphrey, said in an interview that I really liked was he called it the Guitar Hero of linguistics, which is to say that just as playing Guitar Hero is this super abstracted version of playing guitar that feels like you're playing guitar, but is so much simplified in comparison to an actual guitar and all the skills that's required to actually play one. This is kind of the same thing. It's the like super simplified, abstracted version of learning a language that gives you the payoff of feeling smart about learning a language without, you're still doing some work here. This is still something that, takes some deduction and I don't know, just work. Yeah, but it's not as complex as it seems on the surface when you're first presented with a bunch of gibberish looking, vaguely, I guess, sort of Arabic-ish looking characters, and you kind of have to like start making guesses as to what things mean with almost no context whatsoever.
Oh no, that's I like the Guitar Hero version, that it's like playing the guitar, but it's not really like playing the guitar, and it's not really the same skill set. But I do like the idea that there's so many compounds and so many of the ideas kind of build on each other. So if you learn something that you figured out, or you think you have similar words with similar shapes or similar glyphs or whatever we're going to call them, that if light is part of this one, then maybe this one is also heaven or movement. And so some of it looks like certain ideas, and some of the same ideas are copied into other kinds of words. Like, it's that analog helps you build things, but also gives you so much of a range of connotations. And Laura, talk about the parts of speech. Like, I think you discovered that before even I realized what they were doing.
Totally.
Yes. So I realized pretty quickly that a good way to make better guesses is to start looking at parts of speech markers, because there are things that you'll start seeing a lot of pictorial symbols over and over again, and you can kind of associate them with an idea or a concept, but then you start looking at the word chunks and you think, okay, this is also using a symbol, but there's something in front of it different. Is it saying it's like this? Is it saying it's of this? Is it saying it's a noun, an adjective? Is it a verb? You can kind of start thinking about parts of speech, and I think that's when I guessed better, because often the words underneath may have two or three that work, but only one works for the part of speech, or only one works with the symbol. So I think it's kind of a self-confirming way. The more you recognize, the more likely you are that your guesses are correct. And it is daunting, but it's self-fulfilling, because if you guess correctly, or if you guess incorrectly, once they fix it, you kind of can fix a whole lot in one go. Like, once you correct a mistake, about 20 words change. And it's great because you might just fix 20 words.
It's so rewarding. I love that.
To explain a little bit more about how that works, like I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to talk about the sort of parts of speech, like exactly how that works in terms of the language. Obviously, that is something that like is part of the puzzle, but do you think that's too spoilery for us to talk about like specifically how that works?
I don't want to give away individual characters, but I will say that to me it felt a little bit like, I don't speak German, but it felt like my interpretation of German, which is that a word and concept is really 5 or 6 glyphs stuck together.
Yes.
Each means something. So like, once you kind of look at a bundle, you can be like, oh, that is this, not this, which I guess is a way you could describe heaven.
So an early example of that is one of the very first glyphs or words which is a combination of glyphs that you learn is, I think it's either God or goddess. Mm-hmm. And then, for example, like that begins with a symbol that kind of seems, if you find enough words that begin with that symbol, you start to realize this is proper nouns or people. And then you might find that same combination of symbols, but with a different beginning. And maybe you've come from context to know that first symbol means of or for. And so you might find that same combination of symbols that means goddess combined with for might mean holy, in a sense of for goddess, that kind of thing. And it gets much more complicated than that. There's a lot of these combinations, and sometimes a word might be made up of this, for this, not this, is like this, like quite complex.
And you're trying to figure out if it's with, for, or of, and it's a fun puzzle because prepositions are hard.
It's like using a case system without a case system. Yeah. And all the compound, it varies much like is like German, I think.
What is
actually.
a case system?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So a case system is in a lot of languages, and certainly in Latin and Greek, but also actually in German too. Not only do you have like compound words, but the endings of words can give you a hint as to their part of speech, or even sort of like have the preposition baked in. So like the dative is like to or for, and the ablative, like this particular ending says, okay, this word is by, with, or from something, or this word in the nominative is the subject, and this one in the accusative is the direct object. So even there's like hints at the end of the word that give you a sense of, okay, this is in general how it's being used. So sometimes that's a preposition, or sometimes it's like, this is what's doing the action. So yeah, no, that's absolutely the right intuition. I was like, it's like Greek, it's like German, it's fine.
That's awesome.
Although it looks like some kind of, I don't know, linear A or like linear B, or there's all these like half deciphered, well, we can translate linear B since the 1950s, but there's all kinds of like Bronze Age, like Mycenaean and Minoan languages that people are still trying to figure out exactly what they are, or like Maya. There's just so many different things that I was trying to figure out what they were drawing upon. But I think the parts of speech too is adding to that, or using the prepositions, or something with the X is like not quite this.
Yeah.
One of the things I think is really helpful to the player here is that, this is a constructed language, and we're playing through and discovering it, but the language itself is constructed in a way that I think is very helpful. Of course, there are a lot of these kind of, I guess you'd say, ideographic type images where you have like, I'll just say you probably won't have a big trouble figuring out the word for water or something like that.
It's the training session is the water.
Yeah.
You'll get water.
So of course that's helpful, but also I'm very thankful that they decided to keep roughly the same word order and I don't know what the grammar, I guess, as English, because if it were diverging from that quite a bit, I'd have a really hard time. I'm sure that's not entirely realistic, but it is a huge valuable concession to playability.
I was worried about that, actually. I was like, does the verb need to be at the end? I definitely overthought it, and I was like, well, does it really need to make sense in the way that English makes sense? But yeah, as you say, I think it's a lot more straightforward and a lot more learner-friendly in that way. It's like, oh no, this is supposed to make some kind of sense in English. It shouldn't be totally used in a way that is totally abstract. Or sometimes with the imperatives, or like with some of the verbs, it seems like you can use the verb in a couple different ways, and it gives you that shadow translation in parentheses. Like you can use a verb this way, but it can also be slightly adapted so it can be singular or plural. But yeah, those concessions to making it feel kind of like English make it not impossible. So
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I definitely had that early on when I was in my guessing phase. I made a lot of guesses where like, well, maybe this doesn't have to read like a real English sentence at all.
Yeah.
And I wound up with an enormous pile of word soup that way.
And at times they go, I think there's some kind of, if you try to place a word 3 or 4 times, it'll tell you if it's right or wrong. And occasionally they're just like, absolutely not. There's also a game where you try to separate into different words based on what you throw in, and they'll keep telling you not to use words until you get it right, or you give up. Occasionally there were super long phrases that I gave up on, especially towards the end of the game. But
there's also a lot of phrases where the lead character, whose name suddenly I can't remember,
Alia,
yeah, she will just look at a simple phrase or something and say, well, I have no idea how to translate this. And I guess that's the game's way of saying you don't have enough context here. So there's a lot of logic going on behind the scenes that kind of helps guide you. I think we should also mention, once you've seen and correctly used a word enough times, Alia will tell you, oh, I'm pretty confident about my translation of this word now. And you'll get a check mark that lets you know, okay, you're good. Other words that you're not so sure about will have like a question mark to say, maybe this is right, maybe it isn't.
And if we didn't completely say it earlier, each time you look at a word where you're trying to decide what of the, say, 5 or 6 options in terms of translations it might be, it will show you other words that it thinks are similar that you've already translated in the past, sometimes 2 or 3. And that's extremely helpful because like you might see that situation where, oh, well, there's this same word with a different prefix and I know what that means in this other context. But even if it's just like got a couple of overlapping characters in a similar order. It might not mean anything close to the same thing, but it might remind you, oh yeah, I remember the last time that I was translating this, I think I thought that this particular symbol meant motion or meant verb or meant life or something like that. Just kind of reminds you where you've seen this stuff before. So while I still recommend it, you probably don't have to take really detailed notes as you're working through this, because it does keep track of some of that state for you. It keeps track of what words you know, that sort of thing.
And at any time you can press a button and get the full list of everything you've ever seen. And you can also see just your untranslated things that are unsolved. And it does not auto-solve things for you. So if later in the game you've gotten another 40 words and you go back, you might still have things that when you pop up, it's like, oh, nope, you've got all these words now. It is now solved. But it can be really good to go back especially if you're kind of done with adventuring on the map, which we haven't even talked about. It's good to look back and see what you've solved and haven't solved, just to see what mysteries might still be there. And there are mysteries in this game. There is a lot of, it's not just solving language to know what is on this block. It is a peek back into history. And the whole point is to kind of figure out the mysteries of history. Did not mean to rhyme there. Sorry, everybody.
I think it's kind of important that we started by talking about the language learning mechanic here, even though so that might make up about a third of the time that you spend interacting with this game, potentially even less if you're really good at it. But it's pretty core to the experience. Something I thought was really interesting about this is you look at this game and this, on the surface, this looks a bit like a cross between an RPG and a point and click adventure. You're walking around, talking to characters, and a big significant part of the game is done through dialogue, and in a sense, inventory management. Although you're collecting objects, but it doesn't really do an inventory exactly in that sense. Doesn't really matter. But anyway, I was not expecting this language learning mechanic to be so core to the experience. But there are times in this game where you will be spending most of your time working on the language. Maybe for example, late in the game, I found myself sailing around, finding artifacts and doing translations, sometimes pretty much mostly translating for an hour at a time. So that's sort of important to know, because if you bounce off of this language learning mechanic, I think it's really good. I think it's a really clever mechanic that I found really engaging. But if you bounce off of this language learning mechanic, you're going to have trouble. Almost every moment in this game is punctuated by a language puzzle. You can't pick up a rock in this game without getting a language puzzle along with it that you probably are going to need to solve right there, or you can save for later and solve it later. But this game is drenched in these language puzzles.
Yeah, the more you know about the context in which you find one of the language samples, the easier it is to translate, which I assume is also true in the real world. But yeah, it's great. Later on, you might pick up something on, that gets labeled in your backlog as scrawled on a wall. But where was it scrawled on a wall? Where in the building? What is it near? And so all of that can help you solve it. So trying to solve the puzzle in the moment is often easier than trying to go back later.
And also, it's sometimes part of the environmental storytelling. It doesn't always relate, but sometimes an inscription will appear on a wall and it tells you something about what happened in this building in a way that maybe it's not core to the storytelling experience of the game, because it rarely hides any very, very, very important information in these translations. But it is sort of part of the storytelling of the game. It gives you context on how these spaces were used or how these objects were used.
On the subject of environmental storytelling, one of my favorite jokes in this game was kind of an environmental storytelling call-out. The term in games, environmental storytelling, usually refers to, there's stuff laying around in the level that tells you more about the world or tells you more about what the purpose of the place is and so on. And when bringing a friend to an important ancient temple site, our main character, Alia, brings up, she's like, her friend says to her, this isn't what I expected it to be like. And she's like, well, what did you expect? Finding, and she's, I don't know, two skeletons laying on the ground embracing each other. which is great because it's an environmental storytelling thing, but it's also I mean you're a Pompeii expert. I think that's a thing from Pompeii as well, right?
Yeah, there's some finds like that. Yeah, or like in the supposed gladiator barracks where it's just like, ooh, they had an affair. They found them with their money bags and their rings, and like she was obviously trying to find her lover before she could leave. And you're like, okay, sure. No,
sure.
Can I actually just ask, as you have, given that you have explored Pompeii and you have dug things up there, presumably, did you ever find anything with anything written on it?
I mean, besides coins, not really. So, I mean, it also depends where you're excavating, and the part of Pompeii where this dig is situated is kind of near one of the gates, like the Porta Stabia, and it was something where it was a location that had been used many different times over several hundred years. So it was probably an inn at one point, and parts of it were probably like a fast food stall, essentially. So some of it is like you find animal bones, and you find sometimes pieces of, pottery or coins or things like that. But mostly the kinds of things that survive are either really, really tough, like tiny animal bones or even fish scales. And some of the times actually you find tons and tons of pottery, and not always really nice pottery, but things that can still tell you stuff. So finding inscribed things is pretty rare, but there is actually it made me laugh that there's actually a Roman name for that. It's called like the epigraphic habit. And epigraphic is just a fancy name for like inscribing stuff, that the Romans just loved writing their names on stuff or like making any kind of inscription on any kind of object. So it is a thing that exists, that anywhere, like Laura was saying, you can go in the Mediterranean and find thousands of things. And like there are so many different corpora of Roman and Latin inscriptions and other languages too. But yeah, usually you don't find things where it's like, oh, look, this tells me exactly what it is and what it's doing. But I did like the speaking inscriptions too. The idea that certain objects say like, I am the sword of truth, or like, with this I will write the future, or things like that. Like the fact that the objects sometimes speak in the first person is actually a super medieval thing. But you also have funerary monuments that do that too. So if you read the monument, you're like ghosting or speaking in the voice of the dead person. And so that feels really familiar and cool in a different kind of way. But
that's awesome.
Yeah, I really liked the language of the inscriptions. Like it felt authentically antique while still being like, while still being basically modern English in its structure. Like something about the way that they were, once you got the actual correct translation and you read these little fragments of text, they felt. I'm trying to wean myself off of using the word evocative because I feel like it's a cliche, but they felt very authentically antique and sort of mysterious in a way that I think speaks well of Inkel's full of great writers, but that's like they did a good job on making inscriptions that are like interesting to decipher.
What's the name of the woman who's translated the Odyssey?
Emily Wilson.
So this felt very much like Emily Wilson, who did a modern translation of the Odyssey, which was taking something that was very old and putting modern words to it. I felt that's kind of the tone they were going for, where you're looking at religious objects, like domestic objects, swords, like what lasts is kind of a little bit more fancy than the stuff we use every day necessarily, at least in this game, maybe not in actual reality. So it kind of makes sense that you might have something that feels very heavily charged or wholly preserved, fancy.
Yeah, and so mysterious. I love it. Like, there were so many things where I was like, what does this mean? Or like, what does this refer to? And I think we haven't talked about the dates. That's usually, or not always, but often your robot friend will tell you something about, oh, this dates from probably about the same era as this thing. So you have all of these layers of history that sometimes change when you find something, or this is probably from the site that we're looking for. And so grouping things and trying to figure out what kind of similarities there are between those types of inscriptions. And I didn't get the sense, maybe you guys did, whether or not they were supposed to be separate dialects besides ancient. And
I don't think so. I think it was just like
they made one.
Yeah. They made reference to there's ancient, and then there's Elbereth Patois, which is descended from ancient, and then there's whatever they speak on Iox. So I guess it's just sort of the three. And then even the Elbereth Patois is supposed to be basically ancient. They just don't have the writing system anymore. They only have the verbal side of it.
Something I really liked is you mentioned using the layers of history, but you also will say, like, this is from the same place. It means people went back and forth between these two sites often. And there was one point in the game where I was able to trace some graffiti I found in one location back to an event at another location. And that was one of my favorite moments of the game because I was like, oh, I now understand what they were yelling about.
Yeah, or the things where it's like painted. There are a couple places where there isn't something inscribed, but there's actually like some kind of depiction, or like maybe this is a map, or like maybe it's depicting this other thing. And you're just like, oh, that's so cool. Like I want to know more about this thing. But yeah, that sense that you have connection between these places, and especially, again, to be super nerdy again, we know a lot of things about the past thanks to shipwrecks too, and even like Bronze Age shipwrecks. So yeah, that idea of connectivity, connecting different places and how that makes sense feels really resonant and makes a lot of sense from an ancient kind of perspective. They obviously had some fantastic people consulting on this. I haven't looked up and seen who that is, or people that have a really good kind of working knowledge of, you know, how cultures evolve and change and use language. Like a lot of these things are like, oh yeah, now we found this one piece and we can do something else with it. Or better yet, sometimes you don't need every single piece, and maybe we're going to talk about that. But the idea that you can get like 3 or 4 pieces, and if you can't solve the inscription, you can still get a sense for where another site might be, and the openness of the world with that.
Now that you mentioned shipwrecks, I'm just thinking, yeah, they probably did have great consultants because they have lots of, I guess, history Easter eggs in this game.
Yeah.
Where there are definitely spaceships, and sometimes you wander on little ruins, and there are little space wrecks. Spaceship wrecks?
It's so
Spaceship
cool.
shipwrecks? Not sure how that words.
To tie this part of the discussion back into the mechanics of the game, there is a really interesting combined interface that combines a map, a timeline, and your inscription catalog.
Sort of, yeah.
So every inscription has its place in the timeline, and the timeline is interactive and zoomable. From the first moment I opened the game and you hit pause and you hit that timeline, you can zoom all the way out and see, okay, well, here's the ancient period, here's the empire, here's the fall of the empire, and you can zoom way in and, oh, well, here is now. Here's my birth.
Here is 10 minutes ago when I found that bowl.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's really, it really builds there. Like, you know, you're filling in the map, but you're so much also, your effort is spent filling in this timeline that, you know, because you have all 3 of those things, you know, places, times, and your kind of actual translation work, all tied in a single interface. That to me felt like, oh, well, this is my notes. This is my notebook. And it was neat.
It felt very Return of the Obra Dinn for people who played that game.
Yeah.
It keeps filling in your history for you.
Yeah, I have to admit that, like, I think that, I mean, so Return of the Obra Dinn's interface for that is absolute gobsmackingly genius, whereas this I found pretty confusing at the start. Like, it definitely does all of those things in one consistent interface, which is an accomplishment in and of itself. But when I was first getting started in this game, I found the interface of the timeline and like logbook thing, the pause screen, basically, I found it completely confounding. I could not understand how to use it. And there's simple stuff like if you hit the left D-pad button, it doesn't go left, it zooms out to view all. And like things like that just like continually frustrated me through the entire game. I figured it out eventually, but like this is a menu interface where you have to use both sticks because they do different things like on your gamepad. It's a bit of a confusing interface. I got used to it, but yeah, if you feel frustrated at the start, give it some time. It makes sense eventually.
And luckily it's not as essential as the inscription interface, which I think is much smoother.
That is very
to me, we've talked so much about words and language and story, but we haven't mentioned this is a huge visual departure from 80 Days.
Mm-hmm.
It is 80 Days was much more just a reading experience with a few characters drawn. This is actually 3D environments you're walking through, and it's really distinct. I mean, they got this. You are playing a character who actually wears a hijab. It's much more. It takes that multicultural feel of 80 Days forward, especially in the architecture. These environments have a lot of Moorish, Roman, and like all these different ancient time periods kind of molded on one. And as you move around, you can see different. Sometimes it does feel spacey, but it's always space history. But I think none of this stuff was present in their previous games. I credit that, I think, to a lot of the 4-year time break between 80 Days and this. But it's a pretty distinct art style for I think the characters are very different from the environments.
I have to say that I don't love the way this game looks. Like, I don't dislike it. I think it's fine. But I think a lot of the visual style of this feels like concessions to a small team taking on a project that has really, really epic scope. And they've done some very smart things to manage to do something that, like, if I had to describe like how this game feels to play, minus the puzzle and language element, it feels a little bit to me, this might be a weird comparison, but it feels like a little bit like a combat-free Mass Effect. You know, we have a RPG-like story with dynamic, interesting characters, lots of dialogue choices to make, a narrative that spans many planets where you have to, travel from planet to planet, land, wander around, speaking to people. And like, this is a team of 7 people. 2 lead people, making a game that has a scale that, like, at least for me, felt Mass Effect-like. We're talking about like on the level in terms of scale of games zillions of times larger in terms of budget and team. And so they had to make probably a lot of concessions into what they were going to do. They did not have 3D character designs. All of the characters are presented as these sort of flat models. And they've done a very clever illustrated rotation style where you do have a free roaming camera in 3D spaces. So Alia can walk around and you can see her from any angle. But what it's doing is essentially flip booking through pre-drawn illustrations of Alia doing different expressions and standing at different angles. So, you're a 2D character, a bit of a cutout, wandering around a 3D space that feels sort of like a flip book. And it also has very minimal animation. There's characters have visual novel-esque sort of expression templates that it can flip to have visual, expressions on their faces. But we're talking about really low frames per second animations. Like, we're talking about flip book style, or even like, 2 frames per second. Their walk cycles are like 5 drawings. So it's extremely lo-fi on the character model animation front. Which feels like a concession to having to build this extraordinarily complex world with such a small team and small budget. I don't hate it. I don't love it. I think it's a smart set of concessions that works. It's like I am impressed by how well they were able to make this work within what they were able to do.
I think the illustration was very good. Yeah. So they were making use of, looks like very good hand-drawn illustration for all of those characters. And as what that allows you to do is to have like a broad variety of expressions and have these moments where you show a really cool backdrop and you have your character from whatever angle you want and they're talking to each other, and you're able to achieve that kind of scene, which is very hard to do in a video game on this kind of a scale, which is terrific. So you're going to get these scenes where you have good framing, good camera work, characters standing against one another and having a discussion and having... I've seen games that did all of this kind of thing in 3D, but really didn't stick the landing on that kind of character-on-character interaction. Mm-hmm. And you kind of have to do that, especially in a game like this that is not fully voiced. You're going to be reading everything that everyone says. So if this game had tried to shoot for those 3D characters and had fallen anywhere short of, like, really, really great, it might have ruined the game for me. So I think they picked a really good spot here for it.
Yeah, to me it was clear that they spent most time on the backgrounds and environments. It's almost like there's an artist named Maurice Noble who was famous because he worked on Snow White and he worked on all the Roadrunner cartoons, and he just drew backgrounds. Like, that's all he did. And the backgrounds look spectacular, and then there's kind of 2D characters in front of it doing stuff. So if you ever look at the background of Pinocchio, there might be incredible painted backgrounds, and then everyone just kind of acting in front of it. It felt like that art style-wise. Not saying these are the most detailed environments I've ever seen, but they did convey a sense of wonder. And to me, it was less the amount of detail and more of the particularness of the choices they made. Like, you could tell that they thought about, okay, this is a planet where water is scarce. These are the decisions I'm making. This building should look out of place. This building should look in place. Like, those decisions were there. So I was able to forgive a lot of the shortcuts because I liked what was there. At times it did really bother me that I want to be Indiana Jones. I want to pick up, if there's a crate, I want to look in the crate. Mm-hmm. So I'm always bothered when you're in a cool looking place, you can't look in things, especially if you can look in some things and not others. But again, that's a quibble. I think often it's just, this is a cool place to be in. I'm going to go collect some words.
Yeah.
Or artifacts.
Yeah, and sometimes the shortcuts that they took in order to, do this sort of presentation ended up allowing them to try some things that I think are interesting artistic choices too. So the one that stands out to me is that when Alia, or really any of the characters, are walking around in the space, obviously it's sort of this cutout of a person, right? They occasionally play with the transparency of those character illustrations. So a couple of ways that they do that is, one, for example, like I think I'm speculating here, but you'll find a lot of the characters, their feet are blurry and transparent, whereas their heads are more or less transparent. And I think that probably serves two purposes. One is just a practical one. If you're designing a game where a character has to walk around on unlevel terrain, and your character is a 2D model, like a 2D illustration of a person, their feet are going to look ridiculous because they're not going to intersect correctly with the ground. They're either going to be sticking through the ground or they're going to be hovering above the ground. Blurring the feet reduces that sort of feeling of like what, like it helps not draw attention to what would be a shortcoming. But also the sort of ghostly nature of the characters. The developers said in one of their interviews that they did was that they kind of used that to kind of allude to the, well, I'm not going to put it quite as well as they did, but they wanted to kind of give a sense that, like, as Alia is exploring these spaces, we're constantly thinking about these spaces' history and about Alia creating a history in these spaces that also is sort of lost to time, like so much of history. And so Alia, every time she stops walking, and then starts walking again, kind of leaves a ghostly image of where she was standing for about a second. And they didn't need to do that. That's not like a technical thing. That's an artistic choice. And they said in their interview that it's about kind of giving this, like, in every moment, that visual element is kind of reminding you of how she's sort of leaving her trail in history.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that so much. I was wondering about that too. That, yeah, whether it's supposed to be, are they ghostly, or that they're, I don't know, their experiences in each of these places will leave traces, or they won't, or everything that you do will change something or not. I just thought thematically that was just so cool. I love that I'm glad that they were thinking about that, because I had a curiosity about that. I was like, ooh, was that intentional, or is that, as you were saying, to save some of it? But I love the idea that it's both.
Yeah. I think that's one of those sort of happy accident kind of things. I think that Inkle is really good at, like, these sort of synergies between, like, they're coming up with technical implementation stuff that's really interesting. We'll talk in a minute, I think, about how Inkle does scripting, which I think is fascinating, and how that intersects with their artistic choices. It's really interesting. So
It is very entertaining to me to talk about artistic style and places we went, not knowing if you guys all went to the same places. One of those things is you can sail around a map. There's a whole sailing mechanic, which is very beautiful, but also kind of boring. It's very pretty. It's arguably the prettiest part of the game.
it's certainly the only part that's entirely in 3D.
Yeah, it's all
Once again, that's a great example of realism in the game, because sailing itself in the real world, beautiful but boring.
Oh yeah, I literally jumped for joy in Wind Waker when I figured out how to fast travel.
Yes.
And in this game, if you find sailing pretty but boring, I mean, sometimes it's great because you have good conversations and you can it's like driving. If you have a good conversation, it's tolerable. But if you're just driving and there's nothing going on, it's the worst thing in the world. So I think sailing is arguably one of the most visually defining things, but there's a reason we didn't start there.
Yeah, I think it kind of helps to explain a little bit about what that's all about. This game is a space game, but it's not a space game in the traditional sense. You're not exploring the universe in a traditional space game way where you go from planet to planet or star system to star system and, warp drive engage, that kind of thing. This all takes place in a nebula of habitable moons, and it makes some references to the fact that there are no suns here. There are no planets. These are all these tiny habitable rocks floating suspended in a nebula full of rivers. These are literal water, or it's not clear, I think, whether they're water or some other sort of celestial
It's
material.
a mystery.
Right.
Don't solve it.
Right, but
the robot said something about it for me at one point, but I quickly forgot exactly what he said. Something about ice crystals, I don't know.
Yeah, but there's each of these moons has sort of rivers of what looks like water literally flowing from place to place in a kind of a grid network of one-way streets between all of these moons. And so your sailing means that you have a boat that looks like a straight up boat. Actually, it kind of looks more like a beetle made of wood with a sail on the front. But
it's a dragonfly.
Oh, that's true. It's very dragonfly-like. Yeah, I love the design.
Too. I mean, it's a dragonfly. Yeah,
it's called
very
Nightingale,
low tech,
right?
The Nightingale.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm sorry, the Nightingale. Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, it does look like a dragonfly.
Yeah, I love the look of it. I love the look of it, and the fact that it's on the inside, it's literally made of wood. I love a moment in the thing where they were talking about how they don't make ships anymore, and it's because they don't have enough wood. They're living on these tiny little moons. Of course they don't have enough wood. There's no places to get wood. There's hardly any water. It's really interesting. But anyway, these ships are literal wooden ships that they can use to sail these rivers between the moons. And that's really cool. And it's also super different from what I was expecting, knowing that this was a game that takes place in space. But also, yeah, that whole mechanic is kind of boring. I really wish that it were more interesting, but I'm not sure how you make it more interesting.
I think, as I mentioned, if you're having a good conversation, you can keep that going. It is a place where you get a lot of lore background, and you can also stumble upon unexpected ruins as you go. If you see something interesting, you can kind of grab it, look there. They're not full locations. The robot will jump down what they call a hopper to the surface, grab you a coin and come back up and give it to you. But I think if you don't like it, a recent patch they've added will let you skip it. You can just pass the control to your robot and you can go take a nap on your hammock.
Thank you, Inkle.
So it drastically sped up this game. Had I had that earlier, I probably would be 2 hours less on my playtime.
Yeah, I think I'd only been playing the game for about 2 hours before I got the first update on PS4 and it added that feature. And I had seen somebody mentioning that on Twitter. I'm so glad. So I didn't notice it in the patch notes or whatever, but I'm so glad that they added that feature to sort of, it's not exactly a fast travel. It's you set a waypoint for where you want to go. And assuming that there is no important dialogue that the game wants to deliver to you, and also that you're only traveling over rivers that you've already traveled over before, so known path, then at some point during that process of sailing, you get a button prompt where you can hit it to turn over the tiller or whatever, and have Six, your robot, take you the rest of the way there. And that was a good compromise because you still do have to do quite a bit of sailing yourself, particularly when you're exploring new areas. But if you're just getting from A to B, you don't have to do the whole thing A to B again and again yourself.
I found we keep talking about how would we make the sailing more interesting, because it seems like everyone found that to be a little bit lacking. The visuals there were pretty darn good. I feel like if they had pushed that really hard and given you even more variety to what you're seeing, and made each region of the nebula even more distinct,
it still wouldn't have been fun to drive. I don't even think it was that. I think just the physicality of you have a veer left and veer right button, and just the it didn't feel good. I played.
I think it's just really safe.
Yeah.
You can't hit anything, and if you miss your turn, it will reset you. So I think it felt very safe. It let me focus on the dialogue, and it let me focus on finding places I hadn't been before, which is good. But the trade-off for that was that the mechanics to get through it had to be very simple, so that I could spend 90% of my time having a pretty intense conversation about mysteries of the game. And that was a trade-off.
Yeah, I still don't think I would have taken that trade-off because the dialogue that it delivers while you're in transit is so often sort of like, it feels much less, like it feels like there's a whole separate script for the dialogue that happens in transit, and almost none of it is ever allowed to be consequential. Because, you know, they don't know, I guess, like what point in the game you're going to receive what parts of the travel dialogue. It's just, it's the least interesting dialogue in the game.
It's just lore. It's just backstory.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's what you want. Sometimes it's not. I mean, you're talking to someone who like read all the George R. R. Martin histories and liked them. So your tolerance will vary.
Personally, I would have preferred that this game do away with that entire system and have travel between planets be literally a menu, maybe interspersed with a dialogue scene that happens more or less automatically, like, and don't make me do the driving myself. Now that's probably different from what other folks will feel, and I don't think that spoiled anything for me. Like I didn't like hate the driving, or I keep calling it driving. The sailing.
It feels like driving.
It does.
Yeah. And it feels like driving all on one-way streets, which we all know how much we love driving on empty one-way streets. That's the most fun type of driving.
I found it hard, especially on a keyboard too, because for most
boy.
of the game I was using it that way. And so between the mouse and the keyboard, and sometimes you can sort of like speed up the sail and spread the wings, but trying to do that with the letters on the keyboard and then also trying to do the dialogue at the same time, I actually found it more difficult. So I'm betting with a joystick, it's maybe a little smoother, but probably
it's even easier because it's just the top buttons. Go right, go left. It's very simple. So it feels probably much more peaceful.
It made me seasick, actually. Like, although Tacoma kind of made me feel kind of seasick, so I feel like VR is maybe not for me. But yeah, I mean, between my lack of ability to do that and have a conversation at the same time and not really being able to drive, I was like, oh. But yeah, that sounds like a much more pleasant experience. For as pretty as it was, I was upset that I was like, I feel nauseous. I'm turning upside down because I'm so bad at sailing.
My favorite things about that, and that's all I'll say about this particular feature, my favorite parts were when it really emphasized the three-dimensionality and the twists and turns of these space rivers. There are some moments where you turn and twist through you go over a giant rapid or a reverse waterfall.
That was awesome.
And it brings you up and reveals a cloud full of, or a new sky full of clouds and rocks that you've never seen. That part is great. So if they had a way to really double that down. But yeah, it really is just a way to get from point A to point B.
So I guess I kind of think of this game as divided into threes. And there's the third of the game that is spent learning the language. There's the third of the game that is spent exploring spaces. And I guess I'd kind of file the sailing aspect under that too. And then there's a third of the game that's spent talking to people in a dialogue system. And I mean, if you've played other Inkle games, we kind of know that Inkle does dialogue systems better than almost anybody else in the industry. Like thinking back on things like 80 Days, which had incredible, it was like almost entirely driven through dialogue. It had some fun mechanics regarding things like what are you going to pack and like managing an inventory. But most of that game was about dialogue, talking to people, and all of the really consequential stuff in that game happens through dialogue choices. And this game is pretty similar to that. Like it has really, truly consequential, meaningful dialogue choices in a way that you don't usually feel like you have in video games.
One of the interesting things about the dialogue system to me is that it really seems to flow together with a lot of the exploration elements. You have your constant companion, the Robot 6, and you're in almost continuous dialogue with him, and it kind of flows that into the space exploration, where every time you walk into a new space, there will be little waypoints or selectable elements that can trigger new dialogue choices, and then it continues to refer back to those, because every time you introduce some new area, it really affects the dialogue ongoing between the two main characters. So that part, they managed to really blend something they already do well with something that they're doing for the first time in a really good way.
Often you're looking at something and you'll have one of three choices, one of which is usually really mean. The character's pretty mean, by the way. And also she can guess at what the place is based on her transcription. So it seems like there's a lot of different dialogue choices that you can go into. It's not as simple as some of them that you pick 1, 2, 3, and like you go down path 1, and then you can go down path 2, and then you can go down path 3. It doesn't. Often you choose between 2 dialogue choices, and you never get to see that other tree again. I think that sounds very technical, but your impact on the game is that you make a decision about what you think is happening, and then that might be the basis for your entire interpretation of the area. And also, like, 6 can get mad at you, but it's kind of required to follow you around. So your relationship with the other characters, you can annoy people, you can satisfy people, you can lie to people. It's not often that you get that many dialogue choices that really did seem to change the game. And after our spoiler break, I want to talk about this game with you more than others, because I do not feel like I was on rails as much as I might have been.
Yeah. Something I think Inkle is amazing at is that, like, a lot of developers, and for good reason, aren't able to put resources into content that many of their players will never see. And so because of that, their dialogue choices have to be fairly restrictive. You can't have a choice to have a conversation with a character that 10% of people will see, because it relies on, a sequence of 3 different choices preceding it that maybe only, 10% of people will actually make. That's why so many games have, like, maybe you have dialogue choices, but what that means is you have, like, the Paragon and the Renegade choices, where you can say something nice or you can say something mean, and that's it. And those don't kind of branch in a meaningful way. Something that they said in an interview that I thought was astonishing is that this game keeps track of, obviously keeping track of, like, a state of the game. Like, what do the characters know? What objects do they have? Where have they already been? What do the various characters think of them? And so on. And they think of those in terms of facts. And they have a state tracking system that apparently keeps track of something like 3,500 facts during the course of the game. That's massive. That is insane. And so every dialogue choice is informed by, like, you might have options to say something or not say something based on all of those existing facts, your current state in the game. Astonishing. And I think a lot of that comes from, we'll talk in a minute about, I'm fascinated by the way they script their work, the Ink system, how that allows them to be so versatile with their scripting. But it's really something. Like,
if I can jump in there, the Inkle podcast is really good. I don't know if they're still doing it. They may have kind of dropped off. I haven't seen a new episode in a while, but they have I need to go back and check it. I'm sure they've revived it for this game. They have a lot of, like, discussions amongst their developers, and one of the ones that I heard a while back was their discussion about, like, the creation of this Ink system. And so if this is something that's interesting to you, you can go and learn a lot about it. One thing I do remember is that this is a system that, I don't know what kind of license they have, but they make it available for other games and other developers to use, just because they see a need in the industry for a really flexible dialogue scripting system that could be outside of, your roll your own game engine setup.
So something that when I listened to that podcast that came up was that 80 Days alone had 200,000 words. I do not know the count of Heaven's Vault.
I bet it's up there.
So it's got to be up there. Someone else, I think it was Rock Paper Shotgun, said that this game was more Le Guin than LucasArts. So it's got a lot of verbs in it. Like, there's just a lot of density to it. Mostly because people are, when you're going around and making choices, I rarely experience in a game when I do not know what the right choice is, and when I do not know what the effects of the choice I make will be. Mm-hmm. And in this game, I had a lot of uncertainty. I didn't know if what I was doing was the main path or a side quest. There's really no distinction. It's completely nonlinear, and I didn't really know if I was doing something that everyone else would see or that was just me doing something special. And I also didn't know that even when I had confirmed language correct, if I was actually getting it right or if I was just canonically moving forward. Like, can I get words wrong? I don't think so. I think you have to have a single canonical correct translation of a word. But the game would probably let me go for quite some time with an incorrect translation, change all the words, and then once I scratched that out and replaced it with a new one, the game would then change all the dialogue choices. So my mistakes inform the game a lot more than other places where mistakes are super obvious. There's a lot more uncertainty whether you're on firm ground or not. That feels very correct archaeological.
Yes. I love that that's fab. I didn't know nothing about the ink system, but I also felt very, I don't know, worried or lost at certain points, but it was sort of exciting that I knew that I was within certain bounds and I could die or not die, and we can talk about that later. But yeah, I love that idea that it is so consequential, because it felt really consequential. I wasn't sure how mean I should be or how kind I should be, and we can talk about replays later in the second half, but when I started replaying the game after I finished it the first time, I made different decisions and totally different options opened up or were totally closed off based on what I said. Like, I knew certain things that I wanted to happen and I could no longer recreate those things or allow them to happen because I closed off a different dialogue. And I was like, oh, it's hugely consequential. Wow. I love that that's a feature of the game, and that it's not just something that was like, well, maybe I'm not used to playing this type of game and I'm not really sure, but like, oh no. Like, I almost wondered if there's totally different versions of the mythology that can change based on the order and the way that you frame it. Like, does the history even change? That would be even huger, but...
Yeah, wild.
Unclear. It's kind of great that we don't know the answer.
Yeah.
And I don't want them to answer that.
I love it.
Yeah.
It makes me want to go back and replay everything.
And we've been talking about that ink system a little bit, and I mean, unless you're following the developers at Inkle on Twitter and, reading articles on Gama Sutra, you could be excused for not knowing.
Or listening to their terrific podcast.
Or listening to their awesome podcast. You might not know anything about it. And I think it's fascinating. So I want to talk a little bit about why I think their approach here is so revolutionary and really enables them to do some interesting things that a team this size shouldn't be able to do. So Ink is their script system for writing games. They've been using it since the Sorcery games, and they developed it further on 80 Days. After the release of 80 Days, they open sourced it, so it's available for you to download. You can get a bunch of examples of how it's used. They have an editor that you can download and use to write their scripts, or write scripts in their format. But what's important about Ink is that it's not just like a traditional game script where you're either just writing a text script for dialogue scenes that play out, as is, or some games create their dialogue in the worst possible way, an Excel spreadsheet, where they have to, when you're keeping track of all this complex state and you need to have, keys for whether or not to say something in a particular type of dialogue, then you have to literally write it into an Excel sheet. That sounds nasty. So they created a markup language called Ink. And an Ink script is a combination of the dialogue of the game and also lots of other stuff that is important to that dialogue. So things like a kind of a knowledge model where, what do you know and what don't you know, as well as conditionals for well, can we say this because we don't know whether they know a thing or not. And also sort of what they call interactive film script elements, things like camera shots and sounds. So you might write out a scene in Ink that says, if the player knows this, then we can go into this dialogue tree. If they don't, we have this alternate dialogue tree. And during that, maybe at this point, we're going to play a sound. Maybe we're going to do a particular type of visual camera shot. And all that becomes part of a script that's written out in just literally text. It's got special formatting because it's a markup language, but it's basically just text. And that makes it very flexible. Because they can separate that dialogue and basically script element from the game itself. The game engine interprets that script and can display it in a visual way. So you might write out a scene that has a conversation. The game engine looks at that scene and figures out, okay, we've got two people talking to each other. I need to do an over-the-shoulder shot here. And I can alternate between those two over-the-shoulder shots automatically, programmatically, based on, who's talking when you're reading through your dialogue. And then, of course, you can override that in the script with things like, at this point, we want a shot of the building, that kind of thing. And that means that they can do things like take a dialogue scene that they've written in one location. They can have a dialogue scene that's written out and can take place anywhere because they don't need to build special animations for that dialogue scene. They don't need to build, specific stuff about the environment for that dialogue scene. These dialogue scenes, because they're just a text script and they're being interpreted by the game engine, can take place anywhere, and they can alter them on the fly. And it also means that they have the flexibility to alter them pretty late in development. So, you can write a scene and go back. They talked about going back a week before the game was due to publish, and altering a few things. And it's very flexible and easy for them to do that. They can rewrite on the fly without having to create new animations, without having to kind of reblock a scene, basically. That's amazing.
In practice, this means that when you have a breakthrough, no matter when and where that breakthrough happens, you can immediately have a conversation related to it. You don't have to wait to get to a certain part. Like, you don't have to walk through a door and then that triggers something. Occasionally, yes, if the door is significant, but most of the time it's like, it actually feels like your choices are triggering the dialogue, and it's not just like, hi, we're supposed to have this conversation now because you have arrived here. There's a little bit of that. I mean, when you walk into a room, you do change your conversation, but it's not necessarily like, now I am going to tell you about the history of this location. You can do that when you've walked into the village, when it actually makes more sense.
And it allows for sort of walk and talks, right? You can start a conversation, and part of the charm of this game is that you can be exploring a space while also having a conversation with Six. And it's able to adapt to where you are in terms of things like, where do I put the camera? Are we walking around right now, or are we standing still and having a dialogue scene? It's very clever.
Yeah, my quibble that you walk very slowly is helped by the fact that there's a lot of dialogue, and it's not a chore to go through their dialogue. They're good writers. There are games where the dialogue is a pain and I hate it. This is not one of those.
Totally.
Thank God, because that's what most of the game is.
Yeah.
It's a game about language. The words have to be good.
And
Let's be real.
It's always so interesting. I mean, there's so much mystery and so many things. And I also I was going to say the same thing, that you can speed up a lot of the very slow walking with conversations. But I also like that if you want it to be quiet, you can add you could be quiet, or you can add additional talking. Or at least on the Skype or on the Steam version of the game, you have 2 buttons where you can say, ask a question or respond. Or you can be silent. So for a long time, I didn't ask questions, and I wasn't sure in the early stages, like how much revealing or how revealing anything I said would be to other characters who were around, Six included, like whether or not I thought I could trust him in the early sort of stages. But I realized how much more information I was getting from that. But if I don't want it, I don't have to use those buttons at all. And I can just sort of look at things or wonder or move to a different space, and then the questions will change. So I don't even know how much I'm adding or losing, for better or worse, but it certainly allows you to modify how much dialogue you want depending on where you are and with who you're with.
I had a question about the whole interface that I couldn't figure this out. Maybe somebody else did. As you walk around, you're in dialogue with characters, and you're getting these prompts that are either make a statement or ask a question, essentially, and remark or question. Every so often, those buttons would be glowing in a different color, like pink. Like the remark would turn pink or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Did that mean anything to you guys? I couldn't figure that out.
That to me meant that you were going to be, that it was important that you talk now, that was a new direction or a new piece of information or an insight your character had, and that you had to say it to start kicking that off. Often it triggered when, for example, your character would, quote, notice something. You'd walk up to something and look at it, and then it would have a pink button that was like, ask Six a question about this object. Six knows more than you.
Yeah.
You could opt out. I mean, I never did. I always hit the pink button.
Yeah, more dialogue is always the choice I was going to make in this game, but I guess it's important that isn't always the case.
It was a good nudge
Yeah.
to me. So we're talking about the size of this game and how much, I hate to use the business analogy of the iceberg because I hear it all the time in consulting and it's lame, but it really is. You get a tiny bit of everything available. I will wait a little bit before I play this game again, but I started again because I was super into learning this language and learning the mysteries. And there were things I wanted to know at the end of the game that I did not, just like I did in 80 Days. So they have a new game plus mode where you go back through and you keep all of your language knowledge and all of your guesses, and you can continue moving forward. Something I was thrilled about is that the inscriptions get harder in New Game Plus. So you get an object at the beginning of the game. I assumed it was going to have the same words on it. It is same tonally. It conveys the same type of information, but it's easily 5 or 6 words longer.
Wow.
That's so
you
cool.
look at a statue that just said like 2 words at the beginning. It's the first one you get. So it literally says water goddess on it. You will figure out water goddess. I'm not worried about you guys. I do not count that as a spoiler. But when you revisit that statue, it says like what I interpreted to be like holy goddess of the fields. That's a lot longer than water goddess, and also I didn't have the word fields. I still don't know if fields is correct. That was a guess. So it's much longer glyphs, much longer sentences. If you really like the language and you want to do different dialogue choices, even important objects will have different phrases on them that convey the same meaning. So I think it's, I'm going to give myself a little space so I'm excited about the plot again.
Yeah.
But I think it will be worth my time to replay when I get there.
I think it's interesting that they're doing a new game plus. Looking at something like 80 Days, that's a game that altogether might take an hour to play through. And so it's really designed for multiple playthroughs. This game is 15-ish hours and definitely doesn't feel as designed for that. We'll talk a little bit about the ending after the spoiler break, I think, potentially. But I will say that, like, I would love to reload a save from just before the ending and continue before it. There's a place towards the end of the game where you kind of hit a one-way street that takes you to the end of the game, and there's no going back. And having the option to do a new game plus is great because there's definitely choices I didn't get to make or avenues I didn't get to explore that I would have liked to have been able to do. But I would have liked more flexibility about the end of the game. This has a total autosave system. There's no manual saves. And so there's no way for you to sort of like save scum or like go back and redo something that you didn't like the way that it turned out without playing the entire potentially 15-hour game again. I would have liked that flexibility because particularly just at the end, I kind of felt like I ended the game abruptly and would have liked some more time to go and do some things that maybe were kind of on my vague checklist that I didn't get a chance to do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the New Game Plus kind of helps with that, but not really. So like New Game Plus, very cool. And I'm glad that it has that, but I kind of would have liked more flexibility. So we will have a spoiler break here in a moment. So if you haven't played the game, we're going to be discussing stuff that is deep spoilers. And I don't recommend listening to the spoiler break if you haven't played the game. But if you have, we've got some interesting stuff to talk about post-spoiler break. So stick around for that. Before we do that, listeners of this show probably know that we have a segment we like to do called What's Making You Happy This Week. We'll try and keep it short because this is a longer episode. But first to our guest, what's making you happy this week?
Oh, sure. So yesterday, I went to a local plant sale. They have like native plants, like things that are good for pollinators. So
Nice.
I bought a couple of things that are essentially ground cover because I only have a container garden. But I was really excited to plant these things that are essentially like phlox or other things that are not really meant to be deep-rooted plants that will attract birds and bees and butterflies and things that are good for the mid-Atlantic region where I'm based. So yeah, planting those is an exciting thing. That's one thing that's making me happy this week.
Awesome. Shane, what's making you happy this week?
I discovered the new adaptation of The Tick, which actually came out in its first season in 2016.
Oh, it's so good. I'm watching it right now too, actually.
Oh, really? Yeah. So this is a great show. The Tick has been part of my life since I was a kid. I had some of the comics when I was younger, in a big black and white trade paperback. I loved the cartoon adaptation that I think was on Fox, way back in the day, and the next big adaptation, which starred what's the guy played
Patrick
Kronk?
Warburton.
Patrick Warburton. So the Patrick Warburton version tried to turn it into more or less of a sitcom with no action or adventure element. It basically, and so that one never really landed for me, and it got very quickly canceled. This is perhaps, even including the original comics, this new 2016 version is perhaps the most serious take on the Tick that is even possible. Which initially it was like, could this really work? But it does, and it stars. The real star is, in my mind, Griffin Newman, who plays Arthur, who's really the center of the story in this one. It has Peter Serafinowicz, who was. I recognized him, but it's one of those actors where it's like, where do I know this guy from? And he was the annoying neighbor, I guess, or the kind of jerk character in Shaun of the Dead, and he's been in a few other things.
He's absurdly good in this, but he's completely unrecognizable in the giant blue suit.
He is. He really is. But yeah, so the Tick is in a lot of ways like a parody of superheroes. The comics are basically a parody of superhero comics. This show to me kind of feels like a parody of superhero movies or TV, but even more just a parody of like the ubiquity of like superhero stuff in today's culture. I guess we're back in a culture where superheroes are everywhere, and so having a good send up of that and just of the whole superhero vibe, I guess, is great. So it's short. The episodes are like 20 minutes. There's 2 seasons out now, and if you're an Amazon Prime member, you can just stream all of it there. So I really recommend it.
It's a really, really good show. You're absolutely right. That's a great pick. I guess the thing that was making me happy this week is a bit of a sequel to something that I said about a couple weeks ago. You remember when I said I finally got a library card? I know that's like the dorkiest, dumbest thing to be.
Having fun ain't hard.
I know, it's not. Having fun ain't hard when you figure out how the interlibrary loan system works, which like I've literally never done before in my life. Never done before. But and this is also going to sound really nerdy, but so like I love the Retronauts podcast. If you're not listening to that, I highly recommend it. It's a great podcast about retro video games, and they did a episode recently here where they talked about Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, which I've seen the movie many times, but I had never even thought about reading the manga, which was illustrated and written by Hayao Miyazaki himself. Before the movie came out, and also during and afterwards. It's a much longer story than the movie. It takes a bit of a different turn. And so I've had to go through the interlibrary loan system to get a copy of there's a new-ish, I don't know exactly when it came out, publication of that manga. The manga's from the 80s, but there's a recent reissue of it that was done as a box set. They finally, it's a version that no longer has all of the images reversed. So you reading it right to left, which is, they're not, doing a mirror image of everything in the comic. And they're also not like whiting out all of Hayao Miyazaki's beautifully illustrated sound effect art. Instead, it has an index at the end where it will list what every sound effect means, which is pretty weird. Because every time you see a sound effect, if you're like, I wonder what the heck sound effect they're talking about here with all these, Japanese text, you could flip to the end and be like, okay, so that means okay, got it. But it's a wonderful, like 1,000-page long piece of work that I'm slowly working my way through now. And if I hadn't been able to get it via interlibrary loan, I would never have picked this thing up because, first of all, it's massive and also pretty expensive. But it's pretty nice to get a copy of that, and that's what's making me happy this week. Laura, what's up with you?
So I'm going to endorse finishing your projects. So I built a computer from scratch.
Sorry,
3 years ago.
Fun of you about this.
And I literally just had to buy a copy of Windows and a monitor and a USB keyboard to finish it. And for some reason, this was an insurmountable hurdle. Despite that I owned copies of Windows, I just didn't own Windows 10. To the point, like, I knew people who worked at Microsoft who could get me a copy. I asked them for it. They didn't send it to me. I never followed up. I just was super lazy. I had no excuse. It literally took I went to Free Geek Chicago, which if you live in the Chicago area is underneath a Foot Locker and is a place where they restore old computers and sell them for very little. It's a volunteer program. They sell it. They donate. It's fantastic. Got a monitor and a keyboard for literally $30.
Nice.
And came home and plugged it in and everything worked. So now I have a server. I inexplicably start projects and never finish them. I have a quilt that I've just been kind of dawdling on, and all I have to do is finish the edges, and I haven't finished it. Luckily I'm moving, and I was not going to move a computer I wasn't sure worked to New York. So this was my opportunity to do it. I am overjoyed that it works. I'm really enjoying having it. But honestly, it took me about 2 hours, including the car trip, to get this thing working. It was ridiculous that I hadn't done it for 3 years. And I bet you probably have something like this too. Just do it. Just take the 2 hours and finish your project.
I don't have anything like that. Never.
You've never just inexplicably stopped a project
Laura,
a mile before the finish line.
I hope you can't see anything
as I'm
in the
looking around your
background
room.
of my schedule.
Yeah, you have like 30 projects on your shelves. Just finish one.
Thank you,
It's going to feel
Laura.
great
You're right.
to finish one project.
That'll feel great. That's very good. And Laura,
awesome.
I'm also happy that you have that now, because I think that will open up some. I mean, you've always been able to play like the like Steam indie games, but it was always harder for you because you didn't have a proper.
It was
computer
much harder.
For it, so.
I had to boot camp in, and like I'm going to be so excited to play Ori on a proper machine that will play it without being boot camped in.
Yeah. So that's great. I'm glad you have that now. That's exciting. So thank you so much for listening to The Short Game. We are about to have our spoiler break. If you're new to the show, that means that we are going to play some loud noises, and then we'll be talking about spoilers. So when you hear the loud noises, prepare yourself for the spoilers. Before we do that, a little bit of admin. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. You can find our show on Twitter at _shortgame, or on the web at www.theshortgame.net, which is a great place to look at old episodes. For example, you can go back and search our show notes and find the 80 Days episode that we did way back in episode 36, back in 2014 or 15, which, if you like this game, I highly recommend 80 Days as well. It's on the phone and or mobile, and also on Steam, and it's great. Check that game out. Much shorter than this one. If you want to tell us what short games are on your horizon, you can also let us know through there. So you can go to our website and find our contact form. You can email us at info@theshortgame.net, or you can find us on Twitter at _shortgame. You can find me on Twitter at RayganK. That's RayGanK. Shane, where can people find you?
I'm also on Twitter at 8bitshane.
Laura, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Laura J. Nash.
And other Laura, I know you're not on Twitter, but perhaps I don't know if you have anything to plug, or if there's anything that you want to say in closing here at the end, anything about your work or how folks can contact you or anything like that.
Nope, you can just happily direct questions or anything else to The Short Game or to the other Laura, and I'll respond maybe eventually in another way. But yeah, this game is amazing, and so is 80 Days, and so is archaeology. So
Yeah.
thanks so much for inviting me. It's so great.
Yeah.
Endorsement for archaeology.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. And so
Thank you.
here it is, ladies and gentlemen, your spoiler break.
So before we get into the spoiler break, table talk, I'm pretty sure I'm the only one who went to. I'm trying to speak in code so I don't spoil anybody.
Yeah, I'm not too worried about like super spoilers, but since I am the only one here who hasn't finished, I'll just tell you, I just left the place where 6 was overwritten by some ancient empress.
Great.
Oh.
Okay, so you're further along in the game then.
I don't know if that happened to me.
I don't think that happened to me. Cool.
Oh shit. Okay, I thought that had to happen. Okay, yeah, we had that experience. Yeah, that happened to me.
I got the
Shane.
scene where you like you have is that where you like meet the talking head on a pole kind of thing?
Never met a talking head on a
Didn't
pole.
meet a talking head on a pole. I went to did you find the kid?
Yes.
No.
Where did you bring him?
Me?
Where did you put the kid?
Oh, I think I took him back to Elbereth.
Okay. I took the kid somewhere else, so okay.
Oh, yeah, no, the kid who was in the broken place with a, yeah, and you have to maybe go up, but you don't. Yes, I took that kid back to Elbereth too, and he ran away.
Yeah, same here.
Okay. Didn't do that. So that's how, okay, I'm trying to figure. And did anyone get a thing installed in their arm or a hologram?
Nope.
No.
There's a lot of branching in this.
Did anyone go to the mine? Because I think I had a continuity error after the mine. Like something drastic happens in the mine, and then suddenly I'm somewhere else, and someone who should be with me is not with me, and then suddenly they're there, but there's nothing to explain it, and I'm not sure if that's a bug or not.
I don't think I got that. I'm not sure what happened there. Who are you referring to? Like, who's supposed to be with them? Are you talking about Six? Or
Six is gone. Like, he's...
Yeah, no, I didn't have that happen. No.
You killed Six?
No.
Okay.
No, I went someplace he couldn't go, and then I died, or maybe I didn't die, and then I ended up back in Elbereth. Like, the hopper took me home somehow, but without the ship and without Six. And then I suddenly
I got the thing. Oh, the thing in the mind. I don't think that's recordable. I think that's actually. Yeah, no, I might end up keeping some of this. I think that happened to me. So you meet the sort of statue of the god buried deep in the mine, and then you speak a word to it, and it teleports you across. Yes. Yeah. So I don't think that's a continuity error, or at least when it happened for me. A few minutes after I teleported back to Elbereth, Six rolls up and he says something along the lines of like, "I came back here to find you because I don't know what he had some explanation for how he found me."
Oh, I couldn't get to the bottom of the mine, so.
Did you have to go to get a drink? Because I was told I needed to go get a drink before I went into the city, because I had never explored the place beyond the feet with the slums or the...
I don't know if it told me to do that, but I think I did do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I did that, and I'd never met that guy, and I was like, oh, this place. And then suddenly Six was outside, and he didn't say anything about me being missing or anything. He was just there. I was like,
I wonder if they added a line of dialogue there, because it played out pretty much that same way, but he had a line of dialogue that said something along the lines of like, I forget how he said it, but something about like coming back here because he back traced the teleport or some shit. I don't know.
Right. Okay. Or maybe I played that before they patched it, because there was some sort of patch about a reunion, and I don't know if I...
Oh, that might have been it. Yeah.
Or if that was it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely odd, but it felt like they had some kind of a patch over line of dialogue to explain how he found you. Okay. Yeah, maybe they didn't have that in the version you were playing, because they definitely had. I think when I played it, the first version I was playing was like 1.0, like release version on PS4, and then it updated and I was on like 0.5 or something like that. So like there were probably some versions.
I got that update before I even started.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I never didn't have the ability to like speed up the flying.
Yeah, I'll probably try and keep some of what we were just talking about in, but the point being that there's massive branches in this that you can experience or not experience and so I think a lot of people are going to have very different experiences with this game. It branches in pretty big ways, and that's makes me more excited about the New Game Plus, because like I do think that there's a lot of chunks of this game that I didn't get to see, and I would love to see them. I do feel like at this point, though, I'm going to kind of wait for some kind of a guide, because like I want to, now that I'm finished the game once through, I'm not sensitive about spoilers, and I kind of want to just like, okay, what are the cool things that I missed, and how do I get to those?
There were a couple that came out after a little bit for 80 days that I loved. I think I'm already finding a couple of things where people are posting their experiences and saying things like, "Isn't it annoying that you can't go back to Iox ever?" It's like, what?
Whoa.
How did you do that? How did you manage to get... It reminds me of Fallen London, where there's literally an option where you can be so annoying, you can be so progressive, you get kicked out of the university, and that location closes to your character forever.
Wild.
I can't replay that game. I could never go back to the university, but apparently you can get kicked out of this university somehow. Don't want to do that. But it seems like... there are a lot of mysteries and a lot of branching. And I think something 80 Days taught me is there's small mysteries and there's big ones. There's like little dialogue choices that tell you the lore. And then there's like whole new locations or whole new storylines or events that happen.
Right.
Kind of shocking that you get that much variety in a game of this size. Like, for example, and spoiler for anybody, skip forward a minute if you don't want to hear about a side thing. If you take the kid to Maercy, because there's no kids there and I thought it was nice, he asks you to visit him, and if you go visit him later, he's really lonely, and you have an entire conversation that there are no kids on that planet anymore. For some reason they stopped being able to have kids, and no one knows why. And I was like,
Well, that's interesting and important.
Yeah.
And the game just never told me why. They're like, yeah, we just can't have kids anymore. Like, there's no kids here. Clearly there are no kids anywhere, right? And you're like, I saw kids back on Elbereth. This is weird. But also you go to talk to him and they're like, he's being weird. He keeps talking to the pigs. And if you go, he's like, the pigs have messages for you. And then he proceeds to write in ancient on the ground.
What? That's amazing.
And he just writes, he's like, yeah, I talk to the pigs because I'm lonely and there's no kids. And then I go to sleep and in my dreams, the pigs give me symbols. So someone is transferring ancient to this kid. And they told me what later, when I went back to the inscriptions, basically how to trigger the end game.
Wow. That's so cool.
That's really
including
weird.
A message. And they're like, also there's a message for your friend to give it to her. And her is ambiguous. So you don't know if it's the professor or the version of the robot that Shane and I triggered. So it's just, if I had that experience and none of you guys did, there's probably a million of more of those little things. The developers even posted 10 big questions and a spoiler break.
I think maybe this is something we should go through because I think it's a really fun thing the developers did. On the Steam forums, the developers, Inkle, put up a list of 10, they use spoiler tags, so you have to mouse over them, but 10 big questions that that you can ask yourself after you've finished your first playthrough of the game, and to sort of see if you've caught some interesting stuff. And I thought maybe we could go through these together and talk about each one.
Yeah, and I'd say for the last, if you are mid-game, you're probably safe for our discussion up until like 8 through 10.
Okay.
So if you haven't finished the game, including you, Shane, I would bolt after
number 7. Yeah.
All right, give me the heads up because I still have not finished the game, and I will probably do it because I like it. If I can squeeze in the time, because I have recently become re-addicted to No Man's Sky.
Oh no. Well, we'll talk about that another time, but ooh. So first question on their list was, who or what are the 6 gods? Now, all I was able to get was like, there are 6 gods. They have various aspects like water and so on. And I found the names for, I think, 3 of them. But if they're referring to something more deep than like who or what are the 6 gods, I'm not positive I picked up on it. What do you guys think about this one?
Well, I think I did pick up on part of that because when I brought the friend who lived on Elbereth and was like a tinkerer to the ancient site that had the giant pit underneath it that was on that windswept moon.
The Withering Palace.
Yes, the Withering
You can
Palace.
bring her places? I didn't get to do that at all.
No.
You can bring her. You can bring her there.
Wow.
Yeah,
There's a couple of places you could basically get her on the ship and go anywhere, but the main reason there were a couple of main options. It seemed like I chose to take her to the Withering Palace. That starts her on she basically realizes that the hopper there. So what I figured out, and if you can tell me if I'm wrong about any of this, is that was a place where they were making robots by basically they put not so much making them, overwriting them with living people's minds.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
you sit in a chair, and then a hopper sends a message through your brain and into the hopper underneath and puts your brain in a robot, and then you
what
die
they had is
in the
basically
chair.
a broken hopper that only sent minds.
Yeah.
And they captured those minds into a robot. And by tinkering with it, she was able to send through some of a mind that was still stored in the hopper, which turned out to be an ancient queen.
The first Empress.
The first Empress. I wasn't quite able to pick out exactly. I didn't spend that much time with the character yet, but I believe that she was being stored there in order to become a god or become one of the gods. Beyond that, I'm a little hazy.
Yeah, you're going to learn a lot more about this.
I didn't get that at all.
Didn't get that
No.
machine.
I didn't
That's
get to use I found that hopper, and I could tell that it was like kind of pointed down into that underground area, right?
Which
But,
is
like,
so creepy. I love that
very
underground
creepy,
area.
right?
Yeah.
Oh, but like I didn't figure out.
And I
how
loved
to
that it was
use it.
it looked like an area that was built for robots because
Yes.
they
100%.
very much emphasized that robots were not good at narrow walkways and they needed ramps everywhere.
Climb
Yes.
stairs.
So
Yes.
ADA
Yes.
compliant historical
Yes.
locations.
So funny.
Yeah, it's super fun. If you when you take that path, which again seemed so major, I was uncertain if it was a main path or not. You permanently overwrite your robot.
Whoa.
Wild. Yeah,
That's so
I didn't
cool.
do that.
It's great.
6 stayed with me right until the end of the game.
Yeah, me too.
So the next question on the list was, what exactly happened to Janiki Renba? So I got as far as I could, I found his ship, which I'm pretty sure is a non-optional discovery. And but it wasn't, I never found a satisfying answer for why his ship exploded. Did you guys?
They said something about the
Crashed
fuel.
on an asteroid.
Yeah, or that he tried to use like a different kind of fuel rather than just sailing, and therefore overloaded the system and it exploded. But yeah, I wondered if he uploaded his consciousness into a robot before he died or after he died. That was never really, I think that's still one of the mysteries, at least as far as I got.
Yeah, that was the first clue I had about robots having human consciousness, because 6 picks up some kind of message that seems to like convert him into Renba for a minute.
Yeah,
and
I
then
saw
Renba
that.
speaks.
Yeah,
to him.
and I think Renba we don't know anything about Renba because he didn't bring a robot with him. So I think something happened to the ship. He couldn't hop her. He had to land. He couldn't hop her up. He had to land his ship. And then the ship crashed, and then maybe he died getting off of it, and maybe he put his brain in the hopper. It's unclear, but or he stored a message. But I think it was, I don't have confirmation on this, but I think he didn't bring a robot so the university wouldn't know what he was doing.
But at the Game Plus, the very little bit I've worked into the Game Plus, they said that he did have a robot with him.
So that's
I don't know. Or maybe that robot maybe he was doing both. Maybe he was already like offloading messages or something to the robot. I wondered for a while if 6 was the robot they had originally sent with Renba, and then they somehow overwrote
they did
his
say at some
memories.
point in my game that 6 was Renba's robot.
Okay.
So,
but he didn't go to the last planet,
right?
Is my guess.
Okay.
Yeah. So it wasn't clear. It wasn't clear like when he left Renba.
Right.
But yeah. So yeah, that's definitely something still left for us to explore there. The next one on the list was, why did Mayari bring Alia to Iox? And I only really got as far as she clearly needed somebody to go around archaeologizing for her. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think it has something to do with the language. Like, is that too spoilery? Should I wait on that?
I don't know. I think we're in the spoiler territory. Are you talking about how because she speaks
Elbereth?
Yes.
Elberethian or Elbereth Patois? That makes sense.
And she also had found the Nightingale, which I think contributed to it. The ship was on Elbereth, so it implied that she got her ship from a wreck, from playing around on Elbereth, and she and her mechanic friend fixed it up, and then. So I think there's references to Mayari having a dead daughter around 5 or 6. So there might have been some kind of replacement thing. I don't know if it's like religion
Or the reincarnation thing. That,
maybe
that she thinks
maybe
it's her daughter, and also the sailor that the translation guy is always talking about, the book that he's reading. There's some indication a few places I thought I remember where that maybe the professor thinks that our main character is a reincarnation of that historical figure in the same way that she herself maybe thinks she's reincarnated.
She's real into reincarnation. It has to be part of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole loop thing was still very mysterious.
So mysterious. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder, what do you, this is not on the list of questions, but what do you guys think? Is there a loop?
I think it was created, but that doesn't mean it's not real. I know that it was created. I do not know if that means it is true or not.
Right. Like, as in, what do you think it's made of? Because I think there's different opinions on that, and I wonder if the artificiality has something to do with that or not. Like, is it just water? Is it more than water? Is it not even?
I'm talking about the religious loop that they were referring to.
Oh,
the loop of being born and dying. They have a religion that's organized around the idea of that time is a flat circle, basically.
Yes.
And I don't know. I think it's really interesting. It's interesting thematically because it's it's in contrast with Alia's own belief in the importance of history and understanding the continuity of time. And so she, she believes, that the idea that everything will come around again is bullshit because she's a historian and believes in the linearity of time. I think it's an interesting concept. So, but there are some things I think it's probably bullshit, but I think it's interesting.
But it's also the character who is immortal Like, if you trigger the Empress thing and you talk to her about the loop, she's like, yeah, like, we made up the loop. It's bullshit.
Oh, I didn't get that.
But you're like, but wait, you're immortal. Like, you came back.
Yeah.
So maybe the loop isn't bullshit. Like,
It's interesting.
It's the characters who don't believe in it end up reinforcing it, and the characters who believe in it make you doubt it. So good job on the fake religion.
Right.
Good stuff.
Creators.
So the next question on the list was, why are there robots under Iox? I was a little unclear on this still, even at the end of the game. Like, why were the robots buried?
All I figured out was that the robots were buried by an empress.
Yes.
And I think that's all I figured out.
So it seems to me that the history was, and this is still a little vague for me, but it seems to me that the history was that that there was a period in the history of the nebula where the robots were the masters and the humans were subservient to them. I'm not sure if that was after they started putting people's brains into robots. I would guess probably it was.
Probably after, yeah. It seemed like it was a. It seemed like it was a. I mean, if they did it to an empress, then it seems like it's a high status thing. So why get put into a robot if not immortality?
Yeah. And so at some point, I suppose the humans rose up against the robots and buried the robots under Iox as a way of like sealing them away. But I'm not 100% on that.
Yeah, and did you guys
Because smashing is not good enough.
see 316 anywhere?
I did, yeah, at the
Withering
but I didn't get
Palace?
any context on that.
No.
So I think that in the mine, this is when I said earlier for people listening that I connected something in one location or another. I think in the mine you go and there's a grave and there's a stone and there's a stone for every person, and you're like, I think there's at least a couple hundred here, like between like 2 and 500. I was like, what a specific frame. Like, I think there were 316 people who died there. And I think that the graffiti at the Withered Palace was when it was destroyed. They were like, the people who died in the mine, we honor them. 316.
Yeah, interesting.
So I think that's what the graffiti was, because they said it's from a different time period. So this is a complete me theory. The benefit of and curse of playing a new game is that there are no theories out in the internet explaining to you what's happening. But to me, 316 is the number of people who died in the mine. The robots were buried and they turned off the Withering Palace so that no one else could be created and rule humans.
Interesting. So the next one down was, can pigs really... Oh, no, the next one on the list was, what does Kibenia mean? And that was the word that you speak to the gate, right? If you're at the Elbereth gate, the Cat Kiss gate, that also brings you into the city, but it's a different word.
Yeah.
So I thought it meant pilgrim. Because of some of the context.
That's what Alia thought it meant.
Yeah.
It means pilgrim, and it's also the name of the water goddess of the fields.
Yes.
Right.
So I think it might mean like life. I don't know. Like, it means pilgrim, but I feel like it might mean like devotee. I don't know. Like, there's got to be something more to it.
There was something about that where, like, when you say cat kiss to the gate, it takes you into the city. But then, first you say cat kiss to the gate and it takes you into the city. Then later, if you say Kibenia, it takes you into the city, and the cat kiss word stops working. But then at some point, I found that if I got rid of all of my weapons, then it went back, and I could use the word cat kiss again, and not Kibenia.
Cat kiss, Kibenia is your ability, because it's like the Pilgrim's Gate. I think Cat Kiss is fortress, so you're not allowed into the fortress with weapons. But if you're going as a pilgrim, you can go as you are.
Interesting.
Ooh,
yeah, that makes sense.
I had to get rid of a weapon the first time when I used the word cat kiss as well.
Huh, okay. Yeah, next one down on the list was, maybe Laura, you can speak to this. Can pigs really talk?
I think it's not the pigs, but Amir is getting messages from someone, because that little boy does not speak ancient, and he got 3 messages for me that he wrote in the dirt in ancient. 2 for me and 1 for her. Again, unclear if it was emperor or empress or Mayari, but I don't think pigs can talk. I think that the kid just got messages in his brain and been talking to pigs all day and was like, the pigs must be talking.
So there must be something. There must be some further mystery
reference.
there. Oh, really? Yeah. There must be some further mystery there. So the pigs aren't talking, but what is our question?
Yeah, what is?
Thanks for the weird message.
Yep.
Thanks for the weird question.
Guy. The next one down, number 7, probably the last one we can get to before doing absolute endgame spoilers, is whose feet? And I assume that they're talking about the feet outside of the Elbereth Gate, right? The large statue feet. They're presumably...
Or the ones from the TV show Lost.
Yes. Definitely talking about Lost.
So there's the gigantic statue feet there, and I never learned whose feet those were.
No.
They're all our feet.
I had no idea.
Maybe
Except
that's
God, who knows?
Maybe that's why they don't actually have feet when everyone's walking around with their ghost feet.
Well, that's
not
it.
just
That's
to
it.
save mechanics.
All,
That's
all of the
everyone's
characters in the
feet.
game are
It's
staring at
all
those
of
like,
our
what
feet."
are those? I've never seen those before. What are these strange shapes? So the last few
Amazing.
questions, how did the nebula come to be, is, I think, answered in the end game and pretty interesting.
Yeah, I've got a bolt at this point because
Bye,
I don't
Shane.
know the answer to any of these. I do still want to finish this game. So for those of you who've held on to the episode this long, goodbye from me, Shane. These fine hosts and guests actually finished the game, and I played 10 hours of it thinking that this would be like our other short games, and it was not. This is not a true short game. I'm out.
All right, no problem, Shane. Catch you next one. So the last few questions, 8, how did the nebula come to be? So obviously, it kind of describes this to you in the end game, right? You find the sort of the Heaven's Vault, which is, now maybe I'm misunderstanding some details here, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. But Heaven's Vault is the center of a massive galaxy traveling spaceship that vaults from place to place, or vaulted from place to place, and crashed by sort of intersecting with the moon. And the nebula is sort of the resulting, I guess, sort of spillage of that massive spaceship. And that's why it's not like a system surrounding a sun or anything. It's literally just a bunch of habitable moons strewn across an area of space that's basically one large wrecked spaceship plus a bunch of debris. I thought that was pretty interesting. And then the rivers are part of a system by which the robots that run that ship are trying to recover the ship by transporting water around the nebula. I wasn't 100% clear on the details of that.
It was like a water fuel thing, and I feel like it's connected to Rinba somehow, but maybe he was messing around with rivers.
Yeah.
I really like the spirits idea. I think or I wonder too if this is the kind of thing where if it's been hundreds of years, the humans after the fact have sort of like mythologized these things that were totally mechanical or alien or whatever we want to call what was happening in the vault. But maybe it's both. But yeah, it seems to be some water kind of thing.
Yeah, in the Disney movie Hercules, when they look in the spirits of the dead and it looks kind of like water, but then like faces come out of it. Yeah. That's kind of what I picture the rivers being, except faces don't come out of it. I think that's an accurate thing about how the nebula happened to be. But what is the eagle and sun seem to be like founders stuff.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a deeper meaning to this question, but it's the insignia of the early empire, right? The Holy Empire.
But I think because did the robot at the end turn into an eagle?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I think the eagle might be the like captain of the ship symbol, and the sun might be the ship.
I like that.
Sure. I don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
And I guess they became the head of the empire symbols.
Yeah, that makes sense because it's sort of holy symbols if your religion is surrounding this spaceship. The last question is the question the game asks you at the very end of the game. Do you wish to vault? And I avoided answering that question as long as possible in the dialogue tree of the game.
You can avoid it a while.
Me too.
Yeah. And in fact, it doesn't seem like it at first, but the option does eventually present itself for you to make no decision and leave. And that was what I ended up choosing. I walked out because I felt like, I can't. It seemed like, so maybe I misunderstood, but it was like if you choose to vault, then the ship leaves and everyone in the nebula will probably die. If you don't vault, the ship stays and it eventually sucks all the life out of the rivers and everybody in the nebula will probably die, right? Like
that was the sense I got, yeah.
There's no good choice there in terms of
you can shut off the machine.
Right.
Third choice.
Yeah, okay. Well, what I did was I left 6 behind in order to. Said he was going to stay and try to reason with the machine until finally they'd figure something out. He said it would take him a long time, but maybe eventually he could reason with the machine and find another path. And I thought that was an interesting choice, so that was what I did.
I had been playing. I just was like, I'm gonna vault. I can't go back. I was like, I'm gonna die on this planet. Like, there's no food, no water. I've been playing the character as like kind of selfish. It feels like an insane option, but I was like, honestly, I kept being like, but I can't go back. Like, I'm stuck here forever.
Yeah. So what happens when you vault?
When you vault, you basically are like the whole thing kind of like shakes and takes off, and it goes like black screen, and it tells you like basically like you are now this like origins of a new history.
Ooh.
Like your knowledge of the past is what will be preserved, basically.
Whoa.
So you are basically the founder of the next place you go. So like what you did in that game is basically like your timeline, and you are the living history now.
Wow.
Cool.
That's really cool.
Because it's like you've made the decision, if the world is going to end, to be the living, as a historian, to be the living embodiment of, again, to take another pop culture. It's very Hail Atlantis, Donovan style. Like you stick them on the ship and are like, you 7 are all we got, Hail Atlantis. That felt like what I was doing. It's a cool ending. It's a very like watch the world burn type ending, but you feel like the game does not hammer in the guilt. The game hammers in that like you are all that's left, for better or for worse. And if you didn't figure out what the word for field was before you left, you're never gonna find it. Except you can with New Game Plus.
Nice.
That was mostly the reason why I delayed everything, actually. I did the same as you did, but I thought that maybe I could still go back somehow, or there would be some kind of additional like Deus Ex Machina would be like, oh no, it's fine. Like now you can go and get more advice and like figure things out. I still also felt like I still had other things to do, like Reagan said, but I ended up delaying. And then I ended up saying something mean to 6 without meaning to. And he's like, you don't control me. I'm going to stay here. And then it was over. I was like, what? What did I do? I guess I should have made a drastic choice. But yeah, similarly, I wanted to do other things or just explore other places, or I figured there had to be some other option. Because I was never, as throughout this game, like how consequential everything is. Like, does nothing matter? Are certain things supposed to happen? Or does everything? Apparently everything does, so...
Yeah, it's pretty incredible how consequential everything was and how many branches there are. There's so many details that Laura had mentioned that I hadn't seen in my playthrough at all. And that's what Inkle's really good at. And it's impressive to see them scale that up. You know, it's impressive when they do that in a game that takes an hour to play through and they have as many options as they do. But in a game of this size, it's very impressive how many potential sort of paths this story can take. I really like this. Thank you so much, Laura, for coming on the show and chatting with us about it. It's always fun to have, new perspectives. And
thanks so much for inviting me. I love this show so much.
You actually know what they're talking about.
Although some of you are so much better at other aspects of this game. No, I love that. And I love that there's always, as you said, so much more to discover. It made me immediately want to go back and like figure out what else I've missed or whether there's secrets there are just like in 80 days. So
yeah, totally. Well, keep me up to date if you find anything cool. Yeah, and so I guess that's where we'll leave it. Thank you guys so much for joining us on this episode of The Short Game. Said it on the top, so I don't need the admin, but I guess because I didn't say it in the earlier admin section, if you haven't, now would be a great time to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We haven't asked for that in a while. If you haven't done one, it's very easy and it means a lot to the show. And that's the main way that you can support us. We don't have a Patreon or anything like that at this point, so thank you so much